right, good morning, everyone. Paula Romanow here, and we're at the last of our sessions on conducting research, what this means and how it applies to your role. And today we're going to look at what it is, once you've got all your data, what it is you do with it. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to do a quick recap of last week, or last session. I'm just going to add in here, I know that there have been a number of people have been looking for the recording of it, and sadly it wasn't recorded when we did it live, but I will be redoing it and sending it off to Caitlin, and she will have it up next week. I'm probably on Tuesday. So the session 3 recording as well as this one will be up next week. This one might be up a little earlier, but session 3 will be up next week for sure. And last time we got started on looking at surveys, and we didn't have time to finish, so we're just going to wrap that up. Then we're going to look at how you analyze your data, and then a very short bit about how you tell others about your findings. So last session, we started, as we always do, with a recap of what the action research cycle is, because all of this this whole webinar is based in an action research paradigm. Things that we had some things to think about, and some of that was, will your data be credible? What kind of access do I have if I'm trying to get hold of data? We talked about validity, triangulation, and reliability, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I get down to and doing some data analysis. We talked about access and power and the roles that those play when you're doing your data gathering with other participants. We also mentioned that all data gathering methods can be analyzed either through qualitative or quantitative means, but some methods are far more suitable to one or the other than others. We talked about that and about statistics and surveys and things. We also said that it's best not to just rely on one type of data gathering, that in order to guarantee credible data, you need to really use a series of methods, and that all those methods can be manipulated. So there is no real such thing as objectivity. We just have to be very aware of our own subjectivity. And tied into that was the whole idea about unrecognized bias, about things that we are biased about that we may or may not even realize, and that sort of tend to surface when you're starting to do some of this stuff. We talked about method as a toolbox and using the best method to gather the information you're looking for. We're going to talk today about data analysis methods also constituting a toolbox. So method is not all holy. It's a tool. You use whatever one. There's not one that's better than the other. There's just ones that are more appropriate to what the question is that you have. We talked about observation. We discussed about some different types of data gathering. We talked about observation, and we talked about how it is possible to do undercover observation so that participants aren't aware that you're there. But we also discussed about the ethics of that. There is a role for it, but it is a very small role. And we talked more about the explicit observation in which people do know you're there and you've got a checklist. And we also talked how that is going to have an effect on people's actual activities and reactions. And we talked about doing it structured ones using preset checklists and that kind of thing, as well as unstructured, where you simply, like most ethnographies do, you go in with no preconceived ideas. You just make notes on what you observe, but you also have to be aware that you are looking at things through your own lens. So you have to be careful to let the participants be the ones that do the interpretation and not you. We talked briefly about document analysis and how that's a good way to put context around a thing. About looking at, and that documents don't just mean written documents. They can also be graphics, images, sometimes even music. They can be a primary source for your research data, but typically in the kind of, unless you're looking at policy specifically, we tend to use them in this kind of action research more as context information. And we talked about access, we talked about management, we talked about sampling when there's a whole whack of stuff and you need to figure out what's more specific and you're driven by time. And we talked about critical interrogation, which is doing your reading through a critical lens, especially when you're reading like journal articles or even policy. So you're trying to do it with an unbiased view, but you're also trying to do it with a critical view. So understanding where the authors are coming from, what they're grounding this all in. And then we spent most of the day talking to informants. So we talked about interview types and focus groups. And then lastly, we began the discussion about surveys, and we talked about when to use them and when not to use them. And we started to look at how to build them. And I said at that time that surveys and survey creation and use is a webinar all unto itself, and that it would be possible if people were interested in that we could probably, if you get in touch with Connie, we can probably put something together for that for a future thing. But I just wanted to give you the highlights of it. So we're going to start with surveys, but just where we are on the action research cycle that we've talked about. So the first session was looking at the problem identification. Then we looked at the background research, the lit review, that kind of stuff. We did the design piece last week, develop your action plan, and your data gathering, which is implementing your action plan. And today we're going to look at the analysis, which is the evaluation of the results, and then determining whether or not you want to do another flip of the cycle, or whether you're saying, well, no, I think we got what we need, but there's some other interesting questions have come out of what we found that may not be specific to our particular research question, but are things that we could build on for other research. So that's sort of where we are on our research cycle. We're at the top of the cycle, getting ready to launch forth into another version of it. But the first thing I wanted to do, as I said, is tidy up the remaining part of the survey discussion that we had last week. So we talked about the pros of when you want to use a survey and when you don't. And when you do is when you need to reach a large number of respondents, that just way too many. It's a good way of getting a lot of people's responses very quickly. It will generate standardized, quantifiable, empirical data. Like I said, this is the one place where statistics and quantitative measures and methods are most used, statistics and the such. The one good thing about surveys is that they can be truly anonymous. Well, nothing can be truly anonymous because you can always trace things back, but they are about as anonymous as it is possible to get, and they certainly can be done in a confidential manner. And they can also generate a lot of qualitative data through the use of open-ended questions. And when we go through some of the question generation thing, I've got a little bit of an example of a good survey. I didn't want to take too much time in going through a bad survey because we have a lot to get through today. So that's the good stuff about surveys. The not so good stuff about surveys is that it's very difficult to be very precise in your questions. And so if you're not as precise as perhaps you should have been, the people that are answering the survey have no means to either seek clarification or ask a follow-up question. So they have no way of getting back to you while they're doing the survey to say, I'm not quite sure understanding what this question is, or the options that you've given me don't really fit. Like I said, it's question development is an art, and I will go so far as to say it's not just a skill, it is an art. And poorly constructed surveys, given that, result in bad data. You're better off not to use a survey than to use a badly built survey, because you're going to get very skewed data. The other thing is, typically when you send out to a large number of people, the response rate, if you get 20%, you're really doing well. If you've got 50%, you've hit the jackpot. So if you're sending it out to 120 people and you get 60 responses back or more, you're golden. Typically, you'd probably get 15, maybe 20 on a good day. which is not to say you can't nudge people to get them to keep going, but that's not the best way of that's something you need to keep in mind. So what I wanted to do very quickly is just go through a little bit about survey construction and talk about some of the problems with generating questions. And I have to say that this, all the following stuff on the questions was something I found a very good document by MJ Dixon, who's at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He's a faculty member there. And he did a really good job. And I thought, why reinvent the wheel when he's done a good job? I'm just going to use his stuff. So that's where this comes from. So the first problem is you need to keep things simple. I will not say don't underestimate the intelligence or lack of intelligence of your course or your participants, because that would be insulting. But having said that, you have to be really, really, really clear. So you should never ask a question that covers more than one topic. So in this question here, when was the last time you upgraded your computer and printer? You're actually asking two questions. One of the things you'll discover as you start building surveys is that there's a lot more questions than you initially thought. I'll just throw 3 or 4 questions. By the time you work through those questions and you get them to the point where they're really clear, you find out that maybe you've got 10 or 12 questions, and that's just the way it's got to be. So a better way of asking this question is, anybody? You can type it in the chat if anybody has some thoughts on this. No. All right. Well, yes, you could. Well, see, that's a bit fuzzy too, Tammy, because you want to have, it might have been at various periods. They might have done some last year and some this year. So remember, you're aiming for clarity. So probably a better way would be to break this into 2 questions. So when was the last time you upgraded your computer? When was the last time you upgraded your printer? And if we did it the way you were doing it, when it comes down to, that's not the question that you're trying to find out though, because they could have had that computer since the dawn of time. Heather says, what type of computer do you have? That's a separate question to what we're trying to find out. We're trying to find out if they upgraded. So that might have been the first computer they ever got. Might be an old Mac of some ilk. But what you're trying to find out is around the upgrade. So the best way of doing that would be to break that down into 2 separate questions. Uh-oh, we've got it just locked up a bit here, guys. Okay, here we go. All right, leading questions. A leading question suggests to the respondent that the researcher expects or desires a certain answer. The respondent should not be able to discern what type of answer the researcher wants to hear. When I spoke earlier about the bias that you're unaware of, the place that it's most often going to show up is in the way you formulate your questions. They shouldn't be able to figure that bias out, but sometimes when you're writing it, you'll go, oh, gee whiz, I can't believe I actually said that. So here's one. Now that you've seen how you can save time, would you buy our product? What is it in here? What do you think that the person asking this question is really looking for? A positive answer. Exactly right. Good, Carolyn. Yes, an easy yes. That's absolutely right. They're looking, by saying that it saves time, so that's a good thing. So you're going to get this. Are you getting ahead of me? Yes, I am. Okay.
Now you're back on it.
There, we're just moving the question box around to see it easier. So we talked about leading questions, and now we're talking about loaded questions. Loaded questions are so easy to do, or not do, but they, can you hear now? Loretta, are you okay? We had just muted the mic for a minute. Just type in there, yes, if you, yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so loaded questions are dangerous. The famous example that tends to be used, which is horribly politically incorrect, is, sort of like, when was the last time you beat your wife, or, spanked your child or something like that, which we would not say. But that is an example of a loaded question, because it just makes the assumption that that's exactly what you did. So a loaded question asks the respondent to rely more on their emotion than the facts. They contain emotive words with a positive or negative connotation. Typically, it's a negative charge connotation, based on the assumption. So in this particular thing, was your difficult job search a result of, and then a list of, probably choices, selections that you need to choose. It's based on the assumption that your job search was difficult. It may have been difficult, and in fact, that's may be what it is you're trying to determine. But what might be a better way of doing this instead of actually saying difficult? Any ideas? That's still a bit of a leading question, but you're on the right track. So do you mean, Tammy, as in what? We're unsuccessful. Yeah, everybody's on the right track, but you're kind of still a bit off. The best way to do this would not to be making any assumptions. The best way would just be to ask the question. Did you find your job search easy? Were there some challenges? Was it difficult? Select one, and then you put a box there. Again, even that, Loretta, is assuming that there were challenges. There may not have been any challenges. They may have walked right into a job and they didn't, there was no problem. This is what I mean about clarity. You need to just ask the question, how did you find your job search? Give them some options and ask them to explain why. So, overtly complex language or sentence structure. This goes back again to clarity and not over assuming. Yes, that's exactly right, Lisa. That's exactly what you would do. Open-ended follow-ups are where you get really good qualitative data. So how did you find your job search? If there were challenges or if you found it difficult, then you could put a secondary question and do another, selection or a Likert scale or something. That's absolutely a correct way of doing it. I like putting qualitative stuff in there simply because you get more information, but you don't have to. I just tend to be a word person as opposed to a select person. There's many ways of doing this. So you need to, again, goes back to what I said, don't overestimate your correspondence, and don't confuse them. That's really important. If you want good data, you don't want to be confusing people. So this question, as it is here, I'm not going to read it out, you can read it, but it has multiple parts. So they're being asked if they're in a foreign country, and then they're being asked to imagine they can't speak the language, and then they're being asked to imagine they have a traveling companion and that their companion does speak the language. And the third response in this is also really complicated. And it assumes that you can't speak the language. So a better way of just asking this might be, what would your coping mechanism be in a language, in a foreign country where you're not familiar with the language? And then give them a list. So ask a friend, do a translator, use Babelfish, whatever the things are. That would be a much faster way of doing this. Response options are not exhaustive. This is really important because people never seem to think about that. people don't die well, some people die at 40, but as a general rule, people live beyond 40. So 10 to 20, 21 to, or 10 to 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and not going beyond that leaves out a whole bunch of people, which is not a helpful thing. Also, if they're not mutually exclusive, this is something I see all the time in surveys. Closed-ended questions require response options that are mutually exclusive. So down here, 10 or less, that's fine, but 10 to 20, well, which one do you pick? Do you pick the 10 or less, or do you pick the 10 to 20? If you're 10 years old, or if you're 20 years old, or you're 30 years old, you've got entirely too much choice. And another category, always give the respondent an out. That's excellent, Carolyn. Thank you. So what the better way of doing this would be 10 or less, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 or greater, or whatever. So make sure that there's no overlap in them. You want to be really careful about overly personal or threatening questions. Sometimes they need to be asked because that's the research that you're doing. But as a general rule, those are the kinds of questions that are much better left not for surveys, but for face-to-face interviews. Because that way you can put context around it and ask the question in as non-threatening or personal way as possible. Obviously, your research question dictates the questions you're going to ask, but it also dictates what shouldn't be asked to some extent. And if you're in doubt, leave it out. That's sort of a big thing. Also, off-topic questions. It's not uncommon somebody will be developing a survey and somebody else will say, oh, you're sending that survey out to this particular population. Can you just throw a couple questions on it for me, which have nothing to do with what it is? It's more a question of access. So just say, no, I think we need to do 2 surveys, and we'll leave it at that. Now, here is an example, and I apologize that it's kind of stretched. This is a survey that we did for an evaluation project that the CEI is working on. And I'm going to go through it very quickly because we're taking up time, but it's just basically the preamble. First thing you want to start out is to thank the people for participating, because they don't have to. They're doing you a favor, so say thank you for that. This was about it was an evaluation survey on on an information session that was given. So you've done the session. Now we were asking if you could give us some feedback. And you want to tell them how long. So it's going to take them about 5 minutes. And this is why we're doing this, because it will be used as part of this evaluation, which will be done at the end of August. So you've said thank you. You've told them, you've asked them to provide feedback. So you've got your ask in there. You've told them how long it should take them. You've told them what it's going to be for, why they're doing this, and how it's going to be helpful. And then again, you close with a thank you. So the first part is just like you want to explain the sections. First part's a demographic piece. So we want to understand a little bit about you. So in this particular case, what not-for-profit sector was not a closed question. It was because all the employers in this group were all they all were coming from the not-for-profit sector. So we want to figure out what. Now you'll notice at the bottom of that first list, it says other, and then a space for please explain. And we always give them the options to not answer the question. Always, always, always. Very important, especially when you're looking for demographic. Some people just don't want to tell you that. So that goes back to your comment, Carolyn, about always give them an out, another category. So you'll notice how many employees, and always I would rather not answer this question. That's always an option. Full or part-time students, what is their role? What role is indicated? Are you the students? Please check all that apply. And what role are you the students' direct supervisor, just their employer? What other role do you play? Maybe they're a mentor, maybe they're a coworker, whatever. And again, I'd rather not answer. So that's that. Now, those are all selection pieces, and they can select. And there's a flaw in this because it should have said, please select one per question, because sometimes you can say select all that apply. In this case, please only select one, and it's kind of I mean, somebody could be an executive director and a manager in a small organization. And so there are some flaws in this as well. This is why you beta test things. This is the initial draft of this. So the next set of questions is actually asking specifically about the information session. And this one is about, these are all varying rating scales, typically called a Likert scale. On a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied with you with the session? So 1, you tell them what it is. Always give them the middle. So these scales should typically always be an odd number because there should be a middle neutral ground that they have the option where they didn't care about it. And then it goes through. And then you'll notice on question 2, we wanted to get a little bit more information. And so you say, if you felt the session was either too long or too short, what would you say would be the right length? So then we've left, instead, we could have given them options, but we wanted to give them some leeway into saying a whole morning was too long, could have been done in an hour, I would have enjoyed the whole day, whatever. So it's giving them a little bit of leeway. And then about the different things that were used in this particular information session. And again, one end of the scale, neutral, and then the other end of the scale. So that's a very, very quick look at surveys. And like I said, I just breezed through that because I said I would tidy up from the last one. And I have a sense from some of the feedback I've gotten over the last couple of weeks that people might be very interested in actually having a entire webinar session on survey construction. So if that's the case, like I said, please get hold of Connie and Course here at the NSCDA and let her know. Okay, so moving on. You've done your surveys, you've done your interviews, you've done all that stuff, you've got all your data. What the heck do you do with it? Data analysis, just like the method you choose, is also a toolbox. Certain types of analysis go with certain types of data gathering methods. And you need to have the right tool for the job, or else your data is skewed, because the data gathering is important, and that you do it rigorously and accurately, that's important. But what's more important is that you do the analysis of that data. It's like they say, bad data in, bad results, bad data out. There's lots of tools to choose from. There's far more than I've listed here. There's a ton of them. A lot of them are very academic and highly theoretical, and I just didn't even bother going there for you guys. These are sort of the ones that I'm going to talk about because they're the ones that are most usually attached to action research, especially statistics and content and thematic or content analysis. There's also something called discourse analysis and narrative analysis, which are used. Discourse analysis is almost used as much as a thematic or content analysis. And narrative analysis is sort of a big step back from that. So these are sort of the main ones that are associated with action research. There are some thoughts, as always, on the things that we need to discuss before we get into the how to do it. And one of them is that stats, I'm not even going to attempt to begin to cover stats because it is an entire field of study unto itself. And so it's beyond, I'd be spending the rest of the time even just defining the basic terms you need to use. What I am going to say, a basic knowledge of stats, and I can tell you there is a book called Stats for Dummies because I own it, is very useful. You don't have to be an expert in statistics, but if you're going to do things like analyzing surveys and that kind of thing, you should have a working understanding of the basics, especially if you're going to choose a mixed methods study. Survey data, as I said, is the one thing that lends itself best to statistical analysis. Discourse analysis also, when it's done very rigorously and very at a high level, tends to be quantitative. But as long as you can look at a survey and average your question responses or report your percentages, then at least that's a start. So that's all I'm going to say about stats. However, you're going to lose a lot of the richness of the data if that's all you use your surveys for. There's a lot of very rich data that comes out of statistics. So you need to, if you're interested in that, like I said, a basic stats webinar can be arranged. I will not be giving it, but if it's something that people are interested in, again, talk to Connie. It's something we can look at down the road. All types of qualitative data analysis have at their core a common reliance on words and images to draw out the rich meaning. It's all about the words, it's all about the images, it's all about the text in the broad sense. Remember, we said text can be images, graphics, it can even be music, depending on what you're researching. At its core, qualitative research is about deconstructing text, which means basically tearing it down to get at the core meanings and figuring out what those meanings are. And that's how we find the deep meanings, and that's the beauty of qualitative research. To me, I'm a fan. What can I tell you? All qualitative analysis involves uncovering themes that emerge from the raw data and then interpreting the themes for the relationship to the research question. At its core, it's all about finding commonalities between things. In statistics, you've heard the concept of not statistically significant, which is, I think I said this last time, a phrase that drives me to distraction, because quite often, especially if you come at this from a positive or a humanistic or naturalistic mindset, those outliers are the thing that matters, that is actually the key to answering your research question. Sometimes that's the whole point to this. So no matter what method you're using for analysis, the core of it is uncovering the themes that are emerging from the raw data and then looking at those themes, and this is even true of statistics, looking at those themes for the relationship to the research question. It's emergent. Qualitative analysis tends to be emergent, which means it develops as you go along, which means that it's not just one quick look through and, oh, that's done. Usually you go through the data a bunch of times, and usually more than one person goes through the data. This comes back to our concept of triangulation. We've been talking about this all the way through, that when you do qualitative methods, you start by asking the question. If you've designed your project correctly, the data is going to give you the answer, but it's just there. You need to draw the answer out from the raw data. And like I said, this is the importance of triangulation and validity. You don't just read through a transcript, do a quick code of it, and say, well, that's done. You need to go over it, and you need to have other people going over it to get into the deep meaning. You need to put the context around it. And that's where the depth of the analysis comes in, especially once the themes start to emerge. So that's sort of just some background thinking on all this. I want to move along because I've got some exercises on this for us to do. You got all these words. You're kind of buried in paper like this poor soul is. Like I said, when I did my dissertation, and even more when we did a project called HIV/AIDS and the mesh work, I think I mentioned it, about how community-based AIDS organizations learn. We had done 160 discrete interviews, and that is a lot of transcripts. For my PhD dissertation, I think I had 60 some odd. That's a lot of data to go through. However, if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. So for the following exercises, we're going to assume that you've done a few interviews, perhaps you've done a focus group or two, and you've got a whole bunch of transcripts. Maybe you've got some images also that you need to code. And some documents perhaps that you've reviewed, and you've got codes for that. You've got a whole bunch of paper and a whole bunch of stuff that you need to look at. Here's what you're going to do. Notice one was a chaos, and now you're going to start making them systematically organized. Some terms you need to know before we move on with this is coding. Coding is the most important of all the terms that you're going to hear from me. If you don't remember anything else today, you need to remember about coding, because that's at the root of how you do a data analysis for qualitative research, for action research. Coding is analysis. No matter what type of qualitative analysis you're doing. Coding is the process of organizing and sorting your data. Codes serve as a way to label, to compile and organize the data. Note organizing is sort of key in all this. It also allows you to summarize and synthesize what's happening in your data. By linking your data collection, so how you've collected it, and then the interpretation, your coding and the code you've chosen becomes the basis for developing the analysis. So as I said, basically at its core, coding is analysis. And I'll talk a bit more about how you do coding in just a moment. Now, I talked a bit earlier about the most common data or qualitative methods, data analysis methods that are used in action research. So by far the most common is what's called thematic or content analysis. And that's pretty much exactly what it says. You're looking at the content and the context in which the data was gathered. And then you're analyzing it. So you're analyzing it for themes. What themes begin to emerge? And then in addition to that, you're also concentrating on not just what the themes are, what do those themes mean to the participants? How is it treated? How do they talk about something? Maybe it's about a job seeker that's you're doing about attitudes towards, job hunting among university graduates who aren't having much luck and have had to move in with their parents again. So maybe you're doing a bunch of interviews with these people to find out what are their attitudes about job hunting, and your question that's basically your research question. So asking something as broad as that, and you get people that said, I thought it was going to be a heck of a lot easier. And you've got 4 or 5 people that say that. So there's a theme. You've got people that say, I really don't even know how to begin. So there's a theme, preparation and training for jobs hunting. You've got people that said, oh, we did a lot of this stuff. I thought a lot about this as I was working through school. So all my courses were geared towards this. And I was lucky enough to have a prof that or be at a university that had or a community college that had a really great career development team, whatever. So you go through your transcripts and you start pulling the themes out of it and looking at not just how it's treated, but how often that talk is talked about. Something that's only mentioned once is still can be a theme if it links into other things. This is what I said. Outliers in this kind of research are all important. Maybe only one person said that, but that may be a whole launching pad into another type, because maybe that particular person belonged to a different population. And so it's like, oh, this is somebody who's an African Nova Scotian has given me a very different view from all these other people who were basically white, whatever ilk. There's something I need to look at. How does the job search differ for people of color versus sort of more mainstream individuals, university graduates? So then you start to see, we only talked to one person of color in this. Oops, bad us. And I'd say that. I mean, it's possible that was the only person that was available. So then you think to yourself, maybe we need to see if we can find a few more and deepen this. So that's, you need to look at outside variables like gender, role of participant, and that kind of stuff. So that all fits into your thematic or content analysis. I know this is sounding very complex and I'm talking a lot. I'm trying to give you an overview of this, and then we'll actually use some of this in a few minutes. Discourse analysis is basically to interpret the language that is used as it exists within the social and historical context. I like discourse, and my favorite obviously is thematic analysis, because I don't want to say any of these are easier than the others, but they're looking at different things. Again, you're looking at you take the method that does what you need it to do. So thematic content or content analysis is basically that. What are the overarching themes that are starting to emerge from our data? Discourse analysis is looking at what are the things that are emerging from the data, but you're looking very specifically at the language it's used. You're looking at patterns in speech. You're looking at word usage. You're looking at what I call iconic language. So language somebody We talk about the criminal justice system. Well, what does that mean? You start unpacking those kinds of, it's again about deconstruction. There's a type of theory called post-structuralist theory, and deconstruction lies at the core of how you do stuff, which is looking at, if we accept that things have a structure, in this time in history that we're living, those structures are starting to get broken down. So discourse analysis is really good at looking at policy documents, for instance, and looking at the language and the biased assumptions or unbiased assumptions that lie within it. So you're looking at somebody who might call somebody a job seeker or a client or a participant or a human subject if you're talking about research. There are values implicit in language, and when you do a discourse analysis, you start to unpack some of that stuff and you start to deconstruct the meaning to get at what are the general discourses on this particular thing that relates to my research question when you're talking to the participants, not human subjects, please. Narrative analysis is another one which is becoming increasingly popular, especially in action research. You're looking at focusing on the stories being told, the narratives of the participants. These are kind of ethnography we talked about briefly, and this is narrative analysis really links strongly into ethnographies. You're looking at how people construct their stories. You know that 3 people sitting in a seminar room and then being asked to tell the story of that seminar, this webinar, for instance, are going to all come up with very different stories quite often. There'll be some commonalities in them, but there'll be some also different things that are told from their own context. So you need to look at how are they constructed. Some of you are going to say, gee whiz, she spent entirely too much time talking. I really wish she'd done more doing. Well, others are going to say, this was great because I really liked getting the background to it. I can figure out how to do it, but I need to know why we're doing it the way we're doing it. So there's different ways of storytelling or different things that are going to come out of it. So it's going to look at how it's constructed. It's going to look at the intention of the storyteller. It's going to look at who the story is being told to. Sometimes people tell something to one person one way. You might say something to your boss in one way, or you might tell your boss stuff, and you're going to tell your friends on Facebook something totally different. Both sides are probably true. It's just the way that you frame them. So you need to think about who is listening to the story. Who are they talking to? So if you're doing it in a focus group where people are talking to each other, it's going to possibly give you a different result than if people were just talking to you one-on-one or doing this as in a survey. It's all going to come out different. And what you're trying to figuring out is, what is the meaning of the story and plot? So narrative analysis sort of takes a step back and doesn't deconstruct quite as much as it looks more specifically at what the context of the story and the storyteller is. So there's a zillion different kinds of doing data analysis for qualitative and quantitative methods, but these are the ones that are most used in qualitative research and specifically in action research. So just because we haven't got a ton of time left, I'm going to briefly discuss a few of the underlying considerations that apply to these, and then we'll look at the nuts and bolts of coding, because like I said, if you take nothing else away, it's how to figure out how to organize all the data. That's the most important thing. So we need to think about some toolbox thoughts. So what tools are you going to choose? The approach you're going to use is going to determine the way the data is used. And that everything goes back to your research question. What are you trying to find out? What role does the data play? Is it just the words, like in discourse analysis? Is it building towards the larger story? So all these narratives, these individual stories are building towards a larger story, such as that narrative analysis would look at. Is it trying to determine the underlying biases or perceptions of the participants? Again, discourse and certainly thematic analysis. What is the primary focus? What are you trying to do? How is it going to help answer your question? Are you looking at the language? Are you trying to pull themes out? What method do you want to use? As I keep saying, is chosen by what it is you're trying to figure out. The way that your data are reduced. Just remember, data is a plural word. Datum is the singular. And qualitative data, one of the reasons that people that tend towards a positivistic or linear mindset, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a thing, aren't crazy about using qualitative methods is because it's a bit chaotic. It can be very chaotic. It's large, it's messy, and it can be very unwieldy. So this is why you need to break this stuff down. So how you break it down is going to have an effect on the end results. The data reducing, so typically when I teach this in a classroom, I would have a funnel and I show people how you throw everything into the funnel and it comes out in little bits and pieces. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to organize it and reduce it like you would reduce a liquid if you cook, down to the stuff that's the most important, the core stuff. It's a central task, this data reduction, but there's a whole lot of ways of doing it. So whether you're looking at the words, whether you're drilling down to deconstruct, or whether you're drilling up or building up to look at upper level themes, all of those are ways to reduce data. Common to all approaches, no matter what you do, including quantitative methods, is identifying the key concepts, themes, or categories. The concepts will differ. These will all differ depending on the approach. So if it's the language itself and discourse analysis, the concepts are going to be about deconstruction or about deep hidden meanings and biases. If you're looking for overarching themes, you're looking for commonality in experiences and interpretation of those experiences. The concepts that you generate are going to be really hinging on what it is you're doing. Always, and I've said this many times, remember your own place in this. You are not you can't take a God's eye view. Some of us would argue it's not humanly possible. But what you can do is acknowledge your own biases up front, and you're going to quite probably uncover biases you didn't even know you had, because those biases are going to have an effect can have an effect, unless you're very rigorous, on the way the data is, the analysis of the end result of it. Keeping your own context in mind, you can lessen that subjectivity, and you need to let the participants in the data tell its own story. So if I'm doing research with African Nova Scotians, I am a older middle-aged white woman of privilege and high education. I can certainly sympathize with my participants, but I can't empathize with them because I've never been a Black woman. Never been a Black woman of any kind, and I never will be. There are experiences they've had that it's not going to happen. So you need to always take that into, so there's no point in me telling their story. You need them to tell your story. What you're doing is organizing that story so that their story can be told to other people. Okay, so having said all that, I want to talk specifically for the last little bit of this about how you do the coding. And like I said, if you get nothing else out of this webinar, this is the one thing that I hope you remember how to do. So you're going to be coding can be done in a number of different ways. The first thing you need to do when you get all your transcripts, and I would suggest you don't wait till they're all done. I would suggest you do them for the initial read through as you're getting your transcripts in. You read through your transcripts, you note an initial list of potential codes, which is called the preset list. So usually, even before you read your transcripts, you can get a sense of this. The example I'm going to be using is around what supports for employment do people on the autism spectrum need? So that's sort of the general question, or what stigma and those kinds of things come into this. Or even broader, what is the experience of people on the autism spectrum in the workplace or in finding employment? So there's our basic question. Before I even look at a transcript or do an interview, I can think of some initial codes. So there might be something like stigma. There might be something like adaptive technologies. There might be something like social cues. There might be something or lack of social cues or lack of ability to read. There might be breakdown in communication. There could be a whole series of things. So that before I even start, I'm going to develop a quick list of things that I think might show up. Then you're going to read your transcripts, go through them all, and using that initial set of codes, you start coding, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. A code basically, just I suppose I should back this up, is a label, and it's a label that identifies a theme. It's a label that identifies a context, whatever it wants to do. It's an identifying label that you use as you're going through the transcripts, just to collect, to break the data down and organize it. The emergent codes as you read, so you've got your preset codes, and then as you read, more are going to show up. Some of your preset codes are going to go out the window. More are going to show up. And then there'll be subsets of some of the big codes, and then subsets of some of the little ones. Sometimes you may, when going into this, you may have, 3 or 4 preset codes. And by the time you're done, you come out with 40 or 50, or on one memorable occasion, close to 100. Depending on how large your raw data set is. While you're doing this, you need to create a code book. And what goes in that code book are the words that you're using and what it identifies. So maybe stigma, I'm going to use for autism, I'm going to use the word stigma. I'm going to maybe break that down into stigma in the workplace, stigma in culture, stigma by employers specifically, stigma by co-workers, family members, whatever. So then you start breaking it down. It's complicated and messy, but it's effective. So you develop these coding lists, and the coding lists don't really finish until you're done. Think of coding as an way to organize your data. What is it saying? What does it represent? What is it an example of? What is trying to be conveyed here? As you're developing your list of codes, these are the questions you need to be asking yourself. And finally, when you're doing your coding notes, or your coding code book, typically, or notepad, or whatever you're using, you need to make sort of additional notes to clarify what it is you're talking about. You're mindful of what, so you're making connections. It's sort of like a journal. You're thinking, well, gee whiz, I got talking about stigma here, and it really seems to be emerging as a really important thing in terms of gaining employment and staying attached. So what is it about stigma? I may need to do a little bit of extra research specifically around that. So that's the kind of things you do. Now, I want to just add that all of the stuff I'm talking about, you can do it by hand, but there are a lot of qualitative, like QDA, qualitative data analysis software programs, which are an awful lot easier to use than hand coding, because I've done it both ways, and frankly, it's a lot easier to do it the other way. So this is a sample of somebody who was coding by hand. It's about it's a reflection on a workshop that was done. So the question, so this was probably a post-workshop interview, and the reaction. So it was really good. The first paragraph talks about the activities, and you see how people have actually made notes, have underlined outside social aspects. If you were using qualitative data software, you would actually highlight, and it would assign a color to it, and then in a margin would have the same stuff. So this is how you do a code. You read through it. You say, okay, this first paragraph was talking about reaction to the workshop. The whole paragraph was. But there's some subcodes in this where it was talking about the structure of the workshop. It talked specifically about the activities. It talked about the level of participation. The second one talks about the structure and the variety, face-to-face versus remote. So you just go through and read it, and you just assign. So we see reaction, we see confidence, we see increase in knowledge. We talk about some of the traps. We talk about pilot testing. This is what a page is going to look like after your initial read through. We don't have a ton of time left, but I just have a research scrap here. So I'm going to put this up, and I'm going to just ask you just to take a look at it and just throw some very quick ideas down of what you think some of the codes might be. So this is around the autistic. This was an interview we actually did for one of the Now projects. with Autism Nova Scotia. And this is trying to get their finding out some background information about how people on the autism spectrum, like what are some of the barriers that they have to gaining employment. So I'm going to just read it out loud. And while I'm reading, I want you to start thinking about what are some of the codes. So I'm just going to go through the first paragraph because we haven't got much time. So one of the things that we find, and you're asking the right question on this, one of the things we find is that often the people who are referred to as high functioning are the most complex to support. And it's because when you have someone who is what you would like to call, or what you would call like a classic autistic, someone who maybe does like flapping or stimming, the supports that that person needs, nobody questions those, right? Because there's a visible manifestation of that person's disability. But when someone comes along and they have no friends because they have a social communication deficit and they alienate people accidentally, they're over-reliant on family to help them navigating through systems, or they don't have anyone helping with that. They go into situations and consistently alienate themselves, not because of anything intentional, but because the behaviors they've developed over time just do that. So what are some of the codes that you might see coming up in that little piece that I just read? Okay, that's great. So Tammy, yes, social interactions, absolutely right. Social communication deficit, communication challenges. Lisa says high functioning and classic autism. You could even say high functioning versus classic autism. Wendy, support strategies. Yeah, high functioning, and you can separate. You can combine codes and you can separate them. Those are some of the possibilities. That's great. So you're getting the idea. And as you're going through this, you would just mark it down. So some of the code lists I came up with were place on the spectrum, visible or invisible. That's right. Place on the spectrum, manifestations of autism. These are all high, very level things. More in the second paragraph was employer response to the autism manifestation. Stigma, alienation. We can talk about communication. Don't be afraid to code yourself to death because you can always get rid of codes after you've gone through it. So it's great. You guys have got it exactly right. And then the thing you do is that you start taking your codes and you start mapping them into themes. You start grouping themes. You start rearranging them because you need, once you've got all this done, you need to figure out what you're doing with it. And then you put the flow in. You'll notice that themes start to emerge when you start putting some codes together. Gee whiz, I never really thought about that, about that there's that people that manifest different places on the spectrum may show different way, may present differently. And then you're going to come up with themes that don't actually fit the question yet. And I only say yet because what you might be looking at, they may not fit your specific question, but it may be, remember the AR cycle, it is a cycle. That may be where you need to start for the next thing. So maybe what you need to be looking at specifically is the people in this program are actually high functioning. So maybe we need to do more research specifically on them. So this is just a very fast look at codes. And mapping is, people like to do concept maps and everything else. And that's if you can do concept mapping, if you're that kind of a person. I prefer text, but lots of people, my coworkers, all of them except me, are very much into this mind mapping and concept mapping. This is a good way of doing this. The little diagram on the in the upper left-hand corner, that's an example could be of your concept map, your theme map. So that's a very fast look at coding, and I've got 2 minutes left. And I want to leave a minute for questions. So what I want to do is we talked about writing it up. I'm glad, Wendy, I know you are. Wendy is one of my coworkers. So when you're writing it up, so you've done all your data, you've done your analysis, you've come up with some wonderfully incredible, exciting stuff, you need to report on it. What you're reporting on mostly is what you found, not what you think about what you found. That's the bulk of your report. You need to make it easy to understand. So I usually do an executive summary or an abstract if you're writing an academic paper. Put some graphics in if there are people like graphs and charts. I'm not one of them, but lots of people do. So if something lends itself to that, to a quick bite, to feel free to use that stuff. Section headings, break it up to make it easy. More about the content of it, think about the unbiased reporting as much as you can. So it's perfectly all right to have recommendations. You certainly can include your thoughts because you are coming in at this as somewhat of a subject matter expert, but you need to also make very explicit what your final, what's your opinion and what the findings are that aren't strongly opinion based. And there's no reason why you can't put your opinion in there based on your own previous experience. But again, the idea is not what you think, it's what your participants think. That's the important thing. Use appendices. So if you've got stuff that is relative but not specific, like it doesn't fit anywhere in the actual report, feel free to use appendices because they build and they provide context for what it is you're doing. So we've got like a minute for anybody have any questions? And as always, please, if you do, please let me know, just send them along and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Give me a buzz or send me an email. I'm also happy to help anybody with any research they want to do. Yes, color, keeping track, like I said, if you use text, Wendy suggests using text and colored markers to code, crayons, highlighters, whatever. Does certainly, especially when you're doing document review, can certainly help. I am a fan of the Post-it note on the side, which gets a bit cumbersome sometimes, but can also be helpful. If you have a good qualitative data like MaxQDA or Atlas TI or NVivo, you actually can upload documents to it and do the coding actually in the program, which is awesome because it saves a lot of hassle with highlighting and markers and extra stuff. Yes, there are a couple free ones. Because we at the CEI we ended up the one I was most familiar with was Atlas TI, which is a very complicated one to learn to use. It's a good software, but it's complicated to use. MaxQDA, if you go on, if you want, I can certainly send out or get Caitlin to send out a list of my report when we were hunting for a software, because there are a bunch of free ones, but the problem with them is that they're not supported very well. So if there's any bugs in them, a lot of universities develop them. So they're going to be, so I can send out information on some of the free software and some of the proprietary ones, the ones you need to buy the licenses to. They can be expensive, but they don't have to be, and they do different things. The reason I like MaxQDA the best is because it is developed for mixed methods. For those of you that know from software and know about SPSS, which is a quantitative data analysis software, you can upload SPSS into MaxQDA, and it does all kinds of stuff. It's great. So it's anyway, I can send all that out. I know we're over our time, and I know everybody wants to go to lunch, so I won't hold you up anymore. But if you have any questions on this, it feels a bit rushed, but if you have any questions on this or you'd like to do some more around any of this stuff, please let me know or let Connie know, and we'll go from there. And Wendy, yes, the answer is yes, they're going up on the CEI website. I think the first two are already up there, so they can be accessed through that. Talk to Katie about that, and she can go. Thanks, everyone. It's been fun. I've enjoyed doing these sessions, and thank you for your kind words. An evaluation covering all 4 sessions will be going out shortly, and really anxious to get some feedback and see how they can be improved. Longer, I know, talk less, I know. And it's been great. So thanks very much. And like I said, if you have any questions at any time, that's why I'm there. That's what the CEI is there for. Okay, take care all.